The world was quiet, at least on the surface. People were going to work, children were heading to schools, traffic filled the highways, and markets buzzed with energy. It was another ordinary day, and no one had the faintest idea that everything they knew was about to change. It started with the scientists, the ones who watched the skies every night. They had seen strange movements before, comets, meteors, even unidentified lights that never quite made sense. But this was different. One evening, telescopes picked up shapes moving beyond the orbit of Jupiter. At first, the assumption was that it must be asteroids or some cosmic debris. The objects were enormous but steady, not tumbling or drifting like natural space rocks. They were moving with precision, like they knew exactly where they were going. Within hours, the news spread across observatories and research centers. More telescopes confirmed it. Dozens of objects, metallic and geometric, were closing in on the solar system. They were slowing down as they approached, something no natural body could do. Computers calculated their path and delivered the terrifying truth. They were heading straight toward Earth. At first, there was disbelief. Scientists argued, officials debated, governments hesitated. Some thought it was a trick of technology or a rare cosmic event. But as days passed, the images became clearer. The objects were not rocks or stars. They were ships, massive vessels that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. The public was not told immediately. Leaders tried to keep the information hidden, afraid of mass panic. Yet secrets do not last long in the modern world. A leak came from one of the observatories, and soon the media caught wind of it. Rumors spread like wildfire. Alien ships had entered the solar system. Television screens were filled with experts giving their opinions. Some believed it was a misunderstanding. Others insisted it was first contact, perhaps even a chance for peace. But the images kept arriving, and the scale of what was approaching became undeniable. These were not probes or small crafts. They were a fleet, hundreds of ships, each larger than the biggest skyscrapers on Earth. Panic began to spread. Supermarkets were emptied overnight as people hoarded food and water. Airports were flooded with people trying to reach their families. Streets filled with protests, prayers, and confusion. Some wanted to fight, some wanted to hide, and some simply refused to believe it was happening at all. Meanwhile, world leaders held emergency meetings. The United Nations called for calm, but behind closed doors, militaries around the world prepared their defenses. Satellites were realigned, nuclear weapons were placed on high alert, and air forces were stationed around the globe. Yet even in those meetings, there was a silent fear. What could Earth possibly do against something of this scale? The days leading up to their arrival felt endless. People stared at the skies, waiting for something, anything, to happen. News channels broadcasted live updates, tracking the fleet as it drew closer. Scientists estimated the arrival time, and a countdown began, not for celebration, but for dread. Finally, the night came. It began with streaks of light cutting through the darkness. People in cities, towns, and villages all over the world lifted their eyes and saw what looked like shooting stars. But they didn't vanish. They grew larger, brighter, until their true forms were revealed. Gigantic ships, black as night and covered in strange glowing patterns, filled the sky. There was no mistaking it now. Earth had been found. In that moment, silence gripped the planet. Radios, televisions, and online streams all broadcasted the same images. Colossal alien ships hanging above the atmosphere, their sheer size blotting out the stars. They hovered with terrifying stillness, as if studying their prey before making a move. Governments sent out signals, messages in every known language, and even mathematical codes designed to show intelligence. They pleaded for communication, for some sign that these visitors wanted peace. Hours passed, but no answer came. The ships simply hung there, watching, waiting. People's emotions began to shift. Some prayed and begged for mercy. Others took to the streets demanding answers from their leaders. A few celebrated, believing this was the dawn of a new age, that humanity was about to be lifted into the stars. But beneath it all was the same feeling. Fear, deep and unshakable. Then came the moment that changed everything. Without warning, beams of light erupted from the ships. They were not signals or gestures of peace. They were weapons. Entire city blocks vanished in blinding flashes. Buildings crumbled, firestorms rose, and the earth shook under the force of the blasts. It happened in seconds, too fast for anyone to respond. One city after another was hit. Capitals, military bases, major centers of communication, all targeted with precision. The destruction was absolute. Humanity's first true contact with an alien civilization had begun not with words but with fire. Across the world, people screamed, ran, and cried as they realized what was happening. This was not a misunderstanding, not a friendly visit. It was an invasion. The fleet had not come to talk. It had come to crush. The scientists who had first seen the ship sat in silence, horrified by the reality of their predictions. World leaders, once confident in their armies, suddenly felt powerless. And ordinary people, who only hours ago had been living their normal lives, now found themselves in the middle of something no one had imagined possible. Earth was under attack. And there was no warning, no mercy, just destruction. Yet even in those first moments of chaos, something stirred among the survivors. In the ruins of broken cities, in the shelters and basements where families clung together, in the soldiers who still stood their ground despite hopeless odds, there was a spark. A determination not to surrender, not to bow down, not to let the planet be taken without a fight. The first chapter of this nightmare had begun, and it was clear the days ahead would decide the fate of the entire human race. The first blasts had left the world in shock. Skies that once held airplanes and drifting clouds were now filled with burning smoke. Fires lit up city skylines where proud towers had stood only hours before. Families huddled together, hiding in basements and underground stations, unsure if the next beam of light would erase them too. The attacks had been fast, merciless, and deliberate. Entire capitals were reduced to rubble in moments. Communication centers that linked nations were destroyed, leaving governments struggling to connect. In some places, the power grids collapsed, plunging millions into darkness. In others, sirens wailed endlessly as people scrambled for cover. But what unsettled everyone most was the silence of the invaders. They had not spoken, not issued demands, not even declared themselves. They simply arrived, hovered above the earth, and began their destruction. It was as if humanity meant nothing more to them than ants underfoot. In one underground command bunker, world leaders connected through the few working satellite links. The faces on the screens were pale, tired, and heavy with fear. Each nation had suffered. Each had lost. Some cities were gone entirely. Yet they had no time to grieve. The question now was survival. Have they communicated with anyone at all? One leader asked, his voice low but strained. No, came the reply. They ignore every attempt. No answer to radio, no response to light signals, no acknowledgement of any kind. The room went quiet. The truth was obvious to them all. These were not visitors seeking peace. They were conquerors. The militaries of the world scrambled to respond. Fighter jets soared into the skies. Missiles launched from silos and naval fleets positioned themselves along coasts. But within hours, the horrifying reality became clear. The weapons of Earth were little more than toys to the invaders. Fighter jets were swatted down by invisible barriers. Missiles exploded harmlessly before they even reached their targets. Warships at sea were obliterated with pinpoint accuracy. The people watched these efforts unfold on television and online, clinging to hope that their armies could protect them. But one by one, those hopes were crushed. Humanity's proud defenses were nothing to the fleet above, and yet people did not simply give up. In neighborhoods, strangers became protectors. In hospitals overwhelmed with the injured, doctors and nurses worked without rest, refusing to abandon their patients. Volunteers rushed into burning buildings to pull out survivors. In the middle of destruction, acts of courage lit small sparks of hope. But the fleet's attack was not random. As days passed, a disturbing pattern emerged. The ships targeted places of influence, capital cities, military bases, industrial hubs, centers of knowledge and communication. The invaders were dismantling not just buildings, but the very ability of humanity to organize itself. In one small town far from the initial strikes, people gathered in a community hall. Old men, mothers with children, shopkeepers, and workers all sat together, listening to a battery-powered radio. The voice on the broadcast trembled but kept speaking. This is not an isolated attack. It is global. Every nation is under siege. Do not wait for help from outside. There is no outside. We must endure this together. The room fell silent. Everyone looked at each other, realizing that no one was coming to save them. Survival was in their own hands now. In cities where the invaders struck hardest, the scenes were unbearable. Streets once alive with laughter and traffic now echoed with cries and sirens. Families searched through rubble, calling out names, praying to hear a voice answer back. Soldiers carried wounded comrades, knowing reinforcements would not come. And above it all, the ships loomed, silent and watching, as if satisfied with the fear they had spread. But humanity is stubborn. Even in the face of overwhelming power, people began to adapt. Underground shelters were expanded. Old bunkers, long forgotten from past wars, were reopened. Radios were rewired, turning civilian hobbyists into the new lines of communication. In basements and cellars, groups gathered by candlelight, whispering plans to keep each other alive. Still, despair was everywhere. Some people wept endlessly, convinced the world was ending. Others prayed, hoping for a miracle. Yet there were also those who clenched their fists, vowing that Earth would not kneel without resistance. One soldier, wounded and barely able to stand, looked at the sky as his city burned and muttered, "We may not win, but we won't bow." His words were never broadcast, never written in history books, but in spirit they echoed across countless others who felt the same. Meanwhile, scientists worked day and night, studying every piece of data they could collect. They watched how the ships moved, how they struck, how they shielded themselves. Every tiny detail mattered. Perhaps, they thought, somewhere in that information lay a weakness. Perhaps there was a chance, however small, to strike back. As the days turned into a week, humanity's situation grew more desperate. Food supplies dwindled in the cities. Clean water became scarce. Roads were blocked, cutting people off from aid. Entire families set out on foot, carrying whatever they could, searching for safer ground. Many never made it, and yet life clung stubbornly on. In the ruins of a destroyed building, a small child was pulled out alive after 3 days buried in rubble. When rescuers lifted the child to the surface, cheers broke out among the exhausted crowd. It was a small victory, but one that reminded everyone that as long as even one life could be saved, there was something worth fighting for. The invaders showed no sign of slowing down. More ships arrived, joining the fleet above Earth. Their shadow stretched over continents, reminding humanity of their presence every hour of every day. The silence from them was more chilling than any threat could have been. They did not see Earth as an equal, not even as an enemy. To them, humanity was simply something to be removed. But deep beneath the fear, something was changing. Leaders who once argued now shared information freely. Nations that had long distrusted one another began working together. Soldiers from different flags fought side by side. Ordinary people, once divided by borders and beliefs, realized they had only one choice: stand together or perish. In every corner of the planet, a quiet determination began to grow. They were outmatched, outgunned, and broken. But humanity had something the invaders could not understand: the will to fight even when the fight seemed impossible. As one elder said to his grandchildren while they hid in a basement, "They think we are weak. They don't know what it means to be human. We don't give up." The world was battered, burning, and bleeding. But it was not finished. Not yet. The first wave of attacks had passed, but the scars remained everywhere. Cities once full of lights were now blackened ruins. Roads that carried traffic for millions lay broken, filled with ash and silence. Smoke drifted across continents, blocking out the sun, making the world look dim even in daylight. Humanity was still breathing, but it was a fragile, shaky breath. In small towns, villages, and remote places spared from the first strikes, survivors gathered around radios to hear scraps of news. The voices on those broadcasts sounded weary, cracked but determined. "Hold on," they said. "We are still here." For many, survival became a daily struggle. Food was running out in cities, and water was polluted from the rubble. Families dug through collapsed houses not for valuables, but for a can of food, a bottle of clean water, anything that could keep them alive for another day. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Doctors and nurses worked until their hands shook, refusing to stop even when supplies were nearly gone. In some places, they treated patients with nothing more than cloth and boiling water. People who had never thought themselves brave stepped forward to help, carrying stretchers, cleaning wounds, comforting the frightened. Despite all this, the enemy above showed no sign of stopping. The fleet still hung over Earth like vultures. From time to time, beams of destruction cut down new targets: bridges, factories, airfields, slowly grinding down what little remained of human strength. And yet, In the shadows of despair, whispers of resistance began. It started with small acts. A group of farmers hid families in their barns when cities were evacuated. A cluster of engineers cut off from their government managed to repair broken radio equipment to keep messages flowing. A few soldiers, stranded after their units were destroyed, joined civilians and taught them how to defend themselves with whatever they had. Everywhere, people began to realize something important. The invaders were powerful, but they were not everywhere. For every city that burned, there were forests, deserts, mountains, and tunnels where the enemy's eyes did not reach. Those places became shelters, and those shelters became seeds of defiance. In one hidden bunker deep underground, leaders of what was left of several nations gathered. They looked exhausted, covered in dust, but their eyes burned with determination. Maps of the world lay on the table, marked with red for destroyed cities and blue for areas where survivors still lived. The map was mostly red. "They are not trying to negotiate," one leader said firmly. "They want us erased. If we wait, we die." Another leaned forward. "Then we must find a way to fight, even if it is with nothing." Silence filled the room. No one believed they could match the fleet in the skies. Humanity had already tried its strongest weapons, and they had failed. But still, the choice was clear: fight or vanish. So began the birth of the resistance. It was not one army, not one nation, but a scattered network of humans who refused to give in. Messages were passed through hidden radios, through couriers traveling at night, even through coded songs played on broken stations. Ordinary people became messengers, scouts, and fighters. At first, it was only survival. They sabotaged bridges to slow down alien ground machines that had begun to appear. They hid groups of children when ships scanned from above. They found ways to cut power to alien devices by rigging old generators. Every act was small, but it gave people hope. In one ruined city, a group of survivors set a trap. They lured an alien machine into a narrow street, then detonated fuel tanks, collapsing buildings onto it. When the dust cleared, the machine lay still. The cheers that rose from the survivors echoed louder than any explosion. For the first time, they realized the invaders could bleed. Word of that small victory spread. People repeated it again and again. They can be stopped. It did not matter that it was only one machine, only one street. What mattered was the belief that humanity was not completely powerless. But the road was still dark. For every act of resistance, the fleet struck back harder. Villages that sheltered survivors were leveled. Groups caught hiding weapons were annihilated. The price of defiance was high, and everyone knew it. Yet still more people joined. The invaders, cold and silent, did not understand this stubbornness. To them, Earth was a resource, its people a nuisance to be cleared. But to humans, Earth was home. Every forest, river, mountain, and stone held memories, stories, and meaning. To lose it without a fight was unthinkable. In the ruins of a school, a teacher gathered children and told them stories by candlelight. She did not speak of fear, but of strength. She reminded them of how humans had endured disasters before, storms, famines, wars, and had always risen again. The children listened with wide eyes, and though their world was burning, they began to believe there was still a tomorrow. In another corner of the world, a scientist scribbled equations on scraps of paper, analyzing the way the alien ships shielded themselves. His equipment was broken, his lab destroyed, but his mind refused to rest. There must be a weakness, he whispered to himself, over and over. Meanwhile, soldiers without orders roamed the countryside, helping civilians move, protecting families on the run, and gathering supplies. They were no longer fighting for flags or governments. They were fighting for humanity itself. One night, a message went out across hidden frequencies. We are not defeated. We are scattered, but we are alive. If you hear this, know that you are not alone. Fight in any way you can. Protect each other. Humanity will endure. The words traveled far, reaching ears in burned-out houses, underground tunnels, and makeshift camps. People repeated them like a vow. Not defeated. Still alive. Not alone. Slowly, the fear that had gripped the world began to shift into something else. Anger. Resolve. Unity. The invaders thought humanity would break easily. Instead, the opposite was happening. The more Earth was crushed, the more its people refused to surrender. In the darkness of those days, when the sky was filled with enemy ships and the ground shook with their weapons, a new light was born, not in the heavens but in human hearts. the light of defiance. And though humanity was still on the brink, one truth became clear. The story was not over. The early days of resistance had been scattered, small sparks of defiance in a world drowning in fear. But sparks, when carried carefully, can grow into a fire, and that was what began to happen across Earth. In burned cities, in mountain caves, in underground tunnels, people whispered to each other that the invaders were not invincible. They told the story of the machine that had been trapped and destroyed by survivors. They spoke of soldiers who had taken down alien drones with improvised explosives. Every small success was repeated again and again until it became larger than the act itself. Hope began to take shape not as a dream but as a weapon. The resistance was no longer just a word. It was becoming real. In one hidden base deep beneath the ruins of a collapsed city, scientists, engineers, and military officers worked side by side. Their lab was nothing more than a collection of tables lit by dim lanterns. But the minds inside it burned brighter than any flame. They studied fragments of alien machines salvaged from wreckage. Wires, metals, strange glowing circuits, pieces that looked impossible but were real. One engineer, holding a shard of alien armor, muttered, "It bends energy, but not completely. If we hit it right, it cracks." His words lit a spark in the room. Perhaps the aliens were advanced but not perfect. At the same time, people outside the labs found ways to resist with whatever they had. Farmers turned tractors into armored vehicles. Mechanics turned old trucks into moving barricades. Teenagers rewired broken radios into transmitters that could jam alien signals for brief moments. Everywhere, humanity's greatest strength, its creativity, was being unleashed. The invaders had shields that stopped missiles and lasers, but they could not predict the strange, chaotic tactics of desperate humans. Guerrilla groups struck in the night, disappearing before the enemy could react. Small teams hacked into alien equipment, sometimes learning enough to disable drones for precious hours. Bridges collapsed under enemy transports. Mines hidden in forests tore through patrols, and traps built from nothing but scrap metal managed to slow the advance. The resistance was not just soldiers. It was everyone. Children carried messages through ruined streets because they were less likely to be noticed. Old men and women gave advice, teaching younger fighters survival skills learned long ago. Mothers who had lost their homes organized food for those who had none. Humanity was wounded, but it was not waiting to die. In one daring mission, a group of fighters climbed onto the wreck of an alien drone and managed to hijack its communication system. For a few brief minutes, their signal reached across the world. "We are alive. We are fighting. Do not give up." That single message was heard by thousands hiding in basements, by families trapped in war-torn cities, by soldiers cut off from their units. Many wept when they heard it. Others clenched their fists, vowing to do more. Across Earth, that voice became a symbol, proof that humanity was not silent. The resistance grew bolder. In forests, fighters used camouflage to ambush enemy patrols. In deserts, they lured ships into sandstorms where visibility gave humans a rare advantage. In icy mountains, they triggered avalanches onto alien machines. Nature itself seemed to join the fight, guided by human hands. But every success came at a cost. For every battle won, dozens of lives were lost. The invaders responded with brutal force, burning entire villages suspected of hiding fighters. Resistance members knew that if they were caught, they would be executed without mercy. Still, more people joined. To them, dying while fighting was better than living as prey. In one moment that shook the fleet, resistance fighters managed to plant explosives inside a massive alien supply ship. The explosion lit up the night sky as the ship broke apart and crashed into the sea. For the first time, the enemy fleet itself had been damaged. The cheers that rose from hidden camps and broken cities were unlike anything heard since the invasion began. "Did you hear?" People whispered everywhere. They destroyed one of their ships. The invaders, who had treated Earth as helpless, now faced something they had not expected, an opponent that refused to surrender. Still, the fleet remained terrifying. More ships hovered above, and their weapons were endless. Humanity knew the fight was far from balanced. But the resistance had something the invaders did not. They had nothing left to lose except their chains. In one underground gathering, fighters from different nations sat around a fire, sharing stories. They spoke of their families, of homes they had lost, of friends they buried. But they also spoke of victories. One man described how they tricked alien drones into flying into a canyon where explosives were hidden. A woman explained how her group had hacked alien lights, turning them against their own patrols. The stories gave everyone strength. "They think they know us," one fighter said, staring into the flames. "But they don't. They don't know what humans do when pushed to the edge." The resistance was not just about weapons. It was about spirit. People painted symbols of defiance on walls. Songs were written, sung quietly at night, carrying messages of unity. Even in the ruins, laughter sometimes returned, a stubborn reminder that humanity would not let the invaders take away their souls. Meanwhile, scientists worked tirelessly. They discovered that while the alien shields could deflect powerful attacks, they struggled against irregular, unpredictable strikes. That explained why guerrilla tactics worked better than conventional weapons. It was not strength that could break the enemy, but creativity. So the plan became clear. Fight them in ways they could not predict. Use the chaos of Earth itself as a weapon. Turn every street, every forest, every cave into a battlefield. The resistance was no longer only surviving. It was fighting back, and for the first time since the invasion began, a new feeling spread among humanity. It was not just hope. It was belief. Belief that they might actually have a chance. Above, the fleet prepared for another wave, determined to crush Earth once and for all. But below, in the ashes of broken cities and the silence of deep forests, humanity stood ready. They were no longer only victims. They were fighters. And the invaders, for the first time, would begin to understand what it truly meant to face a species that refused to surrender. The war was far from over. The cost was unbearable, but the fire of resistance had risen, and nothing could extinguish it now. The world was not what it had once been. Cities had turned into graveyards of steel and ash. Skies were filled with smoke, and oceans carried the wreckage of battles fought above them. Yet in the ruins of all that was lost, humanity still lived. The resistance had grown into something stronger than anyone had imagined. They were no longer scattered survivors hiding in fear. They were fighters. Farmers, teachers, engineers, children, and soldiers stood together, each one carrying the same belief. Earth was worth every drop of blood, every ounce of strength, every final breath. The invaders had not expected this. Their fleet still hovered in the sky, vast and merciless, but cracks had begun to show. Supply ships destroyed, patrols ambushed, and weapons sabotaged. It all added up. For the first time, the enemy hesitated. They had come expecting an easy victory. Yet Earth had become a battlefield that refused to bow. Then came the moment that would decide everything. The fleet prepared for what everyone knew would be their final strike. Their ships began to gather, forming a massive formation in orbit, blocking out the stars. They were ready to unleash destruction so total that nothing would remain. On Earth, people knew what was coming. The air itself seemed heavy with the knowledge. In underground shelters, in forests, in ruined cities, families held each other close. Fighters loaded their last bullets, checked their makeshift weapons, and whispered to themselves that they would not run. In one hidden bunker, scientists had finally found something, an opening, a weakness. They had discovered that the alien fleet relied on a central ship to coordinate its forces, a massive mothership that sent signals to all others. If that ship could be disrupted even for a short time, the entire fleet might falter. It was a slim chance, perhaps the only chance. The message spread across the resistance. Strike the mothership. The plan was desperate, almost impossible, but there was no other path. Every group, every fighter, every remaining weapon was to be thrown into this last effort. Humanity would rise together, not in scattered defiance, but in one united blow. The night before the battle, the world was strangely quiet. Fires still burned, the air was still filled with dust, but in that silence people reflected on what they had lost and what they were about to risk. Some prayed, some wrote last words on scraps of paper, some simply sat with their families, memorizing faces they feared they might never see again. When dawn came, the resistance moved. From mountains, deserts, and cities, humanity surged toward the fight. Improvised vehicles roared across broken roads. Fighters carried weapons built from scavenged parts, and scientists guided teams armed with devices they had only just invented. Above, the alien fleet descended, beams of destruction tearing into the ground. But this time Earth did not scatter. It answered. Missiles launched from hidden silos, striking the enemy shields. Guerrilla teams in forests triggered traps, toppling machines as they advanced. In the seas, Submarines hidden in the depths rose to fire their torpedoes. Every corner of the Earth had become a weapon, and at the center of it all, the resistance targeted the mothership. A group of fighters using stolen alien tech managed to slip close enough to deliver a devastating blow. Explosives planted on its outer hull erupted in fire. For a moment, the sky lit up with the impossible. A mothership wounded. Across the fleet, confusion spread. Alien signals faltered. Ships broke formation. Their perfect unity cracked. That was the moment humanity had been waiting for. They struck harder, louder, with everything they had left. It was not about weapons alone, it was about will. People who had lost everything charged forward anyway. Pilots flew directly into enemy ships, sacrificing themselves to create openings. Fighters with no ammunition ran into battle with only fire and steel. The spirit of survival roared louder than any alien weapon. The battle raged across land, sea, and sky. Explosions painted the horizon, and the Earth trembled beneath the chaos. It was not a clean fight, not a glorious one. It was messy, desperate, and brutal. But it was human. At last, the mothership began to fall. Flames tore across its surface, its lights flickered, and with a thunderous crash it plummeted from the sky, shaking the ground as it hit the ocean. The sight was broadcast on every working radio, every screen, every device still alive. For the first time, the invincible fleet had been broken. The remaining alien ships hesitated. They could still destroy Earth if they wished, but something had changed. They had seen that humanity would not surrender. They had seen a species that, even when beaten to the edge of extinction, refused to bend. Slowly, the fleet began to retreat. One by one, the ships pulled away from Earth's skies, vanishing into the void from which they came. They left behind nothing but silence, destruction, and a planet scarred beyond recognition. When the last ship disappeared, there was no cheering at first, only stunned silence. People looked at the sky, hardly believing it was true. Then slowly voices rose, cries of relief, of triumph, of grief. People hugged each other, sobbing, laughing, shouting. Earth was still standing. Broken, but standing. In the days that followed, survivors crawled out from ruins and shelters. They saw cities reduced to rubble, oceans polluted with debris, fields burned to ash. The cost was beyond measure. Millions had been lost, and the world would never be the same. Yet there was also life. Children played in the dirt, laughing despite the scars around them. Farmers planted seeds in ruined soil. Builders gathered tools, ready to start again. The invaders had thought they could crush Earth with fear and fire. Instead, they had awakened something far stronger, the unbreakable will of humanity. One elder, standing before the ruins of his home, said softly to those gathered around him, "We were not saved by machines or miracles. We were saved because we would not give up." And that became the story people carried forward. They rebuilt not as separate nations, but as one people, bound together by the memory of their struggle. They painted symbols of resistance on new walls, sang songs of survival, and told their children the truth. Humanity had faced the darkness and endured. The scars would remain forever. The sky once trusted would always carry a shadow of fear. But there was also pride. Pride in knowing that when the universe tested them, when the invaders sent their fleet with no warning, no mercy and only destruction, humanity had stood together and said no. The story did not end with defeat. It ended with defiance. And though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear. If the invaders ever returned, they would not find the same world they had once attacked. They would find a planet united, hardened, and ready. They would find Earth, not weak, not broken, but stronger than ever. Because in the end, it was not the weapons, not the machines, not the strategies that saved humanity. It was the simple, stubborn truth of who they were. A species that refuses to bow no matter the odds, and that, more than anything else, was their victory.